Mistake number 3, do not assume that you can host your podcast files anywhere or locally or on your phone. That does not work. That will not work. There's technical details to that. Hey, this is KB. I'm a technologist, thought leader, and self-published author. I've been publishing ebooks, print books, audio, video, and other content online since 2015. I stumbled quite a bit, tried many different types of content, marketing strategies, software tools, and social media streams. Now I'm here to help you learn from my mistakes and find inspiration along the way. We'll take a journey together to leverage your content, dive into practical tips, and test out actionable strategies that move you from posts to profit. This is the Self-Pub Empire Podcast. Well, hey, welcome to part 2 of how to avoid my mistakes when starting a podcast. There are so many mistakes. I had to cut this podcast up into pieces. It's insane, actually. Podcasts seem to be very easy to make, but to do it well requires a little bit of thought and some work to get through. So I'm really hoping that this helps you out so you can learn from my mistakes, and we'll get through more and more of that as we progress. Certainly, I've looked around quite a bit. I have not found on the internet anything that gave me the real cookbook version of what I'm doing today here for you. And I'm going to try to make sure I've got as much in the show notes as I can. But this is part 2, and let's recap part 1. So, real quick, mistake number 1, don't start recording audio right away. Don't just jump in, put a little thought into it. It's very tempting, but I recommend not doing that. Mistake number 2, make sure you have a goal. Do not go forward without a topic, goal, or domain of knowledge that you're going to focus on. Mistake number 3, do not assume that you can host your podcast files anywhere or locally or on your phone. That does not work. That will not work. There's technical details to that. And I talked about last time in the last podcast regarding how I was trying to use my website, and I found out that it really didn't quite conform to the Apple standard, which is the big dog in the playground, making sure that your podcasts work. So you want to make sure it conforms. And so I had to pivot. I talked about that in the last podcast. If you didn't catch that one, go back and check it out, part 1. Mistake number 4, you need to have some understanding of the terminology, because the terminology will guide you in your journey on how to do it well and hit the ground running. I think really get some efficiencies and some leverage with the right tooling, I think is really helpful. And understanding what it means kind of from a technology perspective, a computer perspective, these things are really helpful. What is hosting? What type of file are we talking about for hosting? MP3. It's the most likely standard to use, has compression, so it's not as big. Hosting isn't as expensive. How do you syndication? How do you syndicate? What does that really mean? Hosting flows through syndication out to your listeners and is streamed that way. So the host actually has the file, and the syndicators like Apple Podcasts or Spotify then allow people to subscribe and listen to it and stream it. So the transfer of file happens as they listen. Episodes and format. Are you doing co-hosted? Are you interviewing? Are you doing solo? This is solo. Are you doing a panel? Are you doing storytelling? A little bit of that. I talk about true crime podcasts quite a bit because they're so huge, and those are the storytelling ones. I'm doing solo and possibly some interview ones with this podcast. So you want to think about what kind of format you want to use or what you're going to talk about. What kind of microphone are you going to use? You can use your smartphone. They have a dynamic microphone. I have my own. I bought a cool Yeti microphone, which I really love. I actually bought it for audiobook making on the ACX platform. That's what I actually used it for to start off with, and it works great. It is USB based, hooks up right up to my computer. So think through those things. A pop filter, that was the other part, reduces those plosives, which is the P's and the B's. Pop filters are helpful, and I actually have one on mine, and they also look cool. USB interface, that's what I use. Well, with the Yeti, it hooks right up to my computer through the USB port and is powered from the computer and transfers audio right there. Digital audio workstation. You want to make sure you have some way to record and edit your audio. I use Audacity, and I add in the resound.fm, which is I can't say enough good things about it. I have in the show notes here too. I'll put this in there as well. But you can go to selfpubempire.com/resound and you can check out how I used it. I'll give you some screenshots of what I did. It's just fantastic. Then you can click the link and go check it out. It is really amazing. Make sure you check out the Apple Podcast requirements. That is, like I said before, the big dog and what kind of requirements you have. And those are the digital type recording requirements, the sampling rate in kilohertz and the bit rate in kilobits per second. Those are like the two main things to make sure that you do the right way. And that reduces your possible exclusion from Apple Podcasting. And if you can conform to Apple Podcasts, you pretty much can conform to any other syndicate companies that are out there, Amazon and Spotify and so on and so forth. They're all out there, but Apple's kind of started the whole thing. So really conforming to Apple Podcasts, that's really the way that most people make sure that their podcasts work pretty much everywhere. All right. So that's the recap of our first 4 mistakes. I have many, many to go, but let's start by jumping into mistake number 5. And this is actually an outgrowth of my Squarespace story that I told last time. So mistake number 5, do not go it alone when syndicating your podcast. What do I mean by that? Well, you really want to make sure that you can get your podcast out to the most platforms as possible. The hosting company really does matter here. Again, you can host yourself on your own website. There are ways to do that. And some sites will just handle it just fine. Like I said, I ran into problems. So I pivoted. I remembered looking this up a number of years back. And there was a company called Anchor.fm. And I thought, wow, what a really cool idea. This is a hosting company that allowed you to syndicate really easily. And they hooked up to a lot of distribution channels and they kind of walked you through it and was pretty nice. There are a bunch of them out there. But what I realized recently, as in just recently, Anchor was purchased by Spotify back in 2019 for $154 million. That's what the reported purchase price was. That's amazing. Unbelievable price tag for a podcasting host. But since it was a really popular tool, what did Spotify end up with? They ended up with a really huge customer base that had a bunch of podcasts on it that I think are probably pretty popular right now. And it gave Spotify a nice leg up towards taking on Apple Podcasts. What I think is interesting about Apple Podcasts, unless I've missed it somewhere, comment for me if you would in the comments section of the notes, or send me a direct message. Somehow, maybe I missed this, but they really don't have tools for you to host your podcasts and syndicates. So Apple really didn't do that. Spotify is trying to because they know there's money in it. Why do people like podcasts? Because they're not visual. You can listen to them in your car. We still, in the United States especially, are a commuter business country. We just are. We love our cars. We love to listen to things as we drive. And a podcast is one of those things that many people listen to. I do myself, or I listen to it when I'm walking. That happens a ton. And that's why podcasts are really important. You can listen to it while you're doing something else. Very much like music, but you don't feel like music, you listen to a podcast. But that is an enormous deal. 2019, $154 million. Now it's podcasters.spotify.com. We'll link to that in the show notes. And I said, you know what? I'm going to check this out because I remember Anchor being pretty well liked and had some positive information on it. And I think it's funny that I actually went ahead, made my mistakes, and recorded some audio, recorded some podcasts, and then didn't really think through the hosting very well until I hit my wall with the hosting that I was doing, and it wasn't going to work for podcasts. There were some issues there. I'm happy to show you what that looks like, by the way, in the show notes. I'm going to put a picture in there of where I ran into problems. Again, I want to educate you on what I ran into so you can do something else and better. I really want you to do better than me. That would be really cool. If I helped you and you put a comment on it and say, hey, Kevin, you really helped me. Boy, those kinds of things really make my day. But anyway, I digress. Anchor.fm is now podcasters.spotify.com. Here we go. So I said, you know what? I'm just going to cookbook my way through this. And it's just a step by step. Here are my steps. Get comfortable. You can take notes. If you're not driving, please don't take notes while you're driving. But I'll put some of these things in the show notes as well. So signing up for the Spotify on their podcaster subdomain. Wait, what's a subdomain? That's podcasters.spotify.com. So it's Spotify, but it's for podcasters. So that's a subdomain. www will be the normal domain. Subdomain, which is the World Wide Web version. But I can explain some of those technical details later and what that means, which is helpful, by the way, if you're setting up your own website. Side note for something in the future. But anyway, podcasters.spotify.com. And I'm not a Spotify affiliate. I just want you to all know. So I really don't get anything at the time of this recording for telling you that I'm using it. And that's okay. But I really seem to work through this well. As a little preview of what I'm talking about here, honestly, I thought it was pretty simple. I really liked it. But let's keep going. Let's cookbook our way through this. So the first thing you do once you sign up is you have to validate your email address. Your email address is actually pretty important in this case. This is where being business ready is really important, because if you have your own domain and website, a domain for your website, you can hopefully get an email address specific to your site. That's really what I'm kind of getting at here. The reason I say this is because the email address gets associated with the podcast itself. So they want a valid email address, and there's reasons for doing that on their side, because if there's an email address associated with it, they know that it's a real person, relatively speaking. I recommend not having like just a Gmail account for this. I really think that if you're serious about business, I would definitely have your own email address. So mine is on there. It's on the podcast. I think you can even email through Spotify, that syndicate, to the email address itself. So I really think it's important that you don't use like a personal email address, that you use a business one. And I think that's really helpful to have because it's associated with the business and it's out there. So it's really important what email address you use. You can change it later, but validating your email address first, that's important because it's listed with the show. Then your option is to, of course, record or upload audio. And this is what I think I mentioned in the last episode. They have a website version of a recording, DAW, that allows you to work on digital audio workstation. You can record on there. I personally did not use it. I like Audacity, which I'll talk about a little bit more later on. That's what I use. So you can record or just upload one. I uploaded one. All right. So don't go it alone. That's mistake number 5. Mistake number 6, do not deviate from the getting started on Spotify. So if you're cookbooking it through this with me and you're on podcasters.spotify.com, sorry, you want to go through the getting started. It's really helpful. And I remember seeing a little bit about this when they were Anchor, this particular piece, but really, really helpful. So as I mentioned, you have the option to record or upload your first episode. Has that recording editing software. I haven't used it. I might try it sometime just to report back to everyone on what I found was interesting and useful about it. There's some cool things that I found, however. I uploaded my audio and it allowed me to do some special things. I could add music from Spotify. So there must have been there's definitely some DAW pieces there. There's free music and free sound effects. So that's another thing to think about from a hosting platform. What kind of add-on or extras for free are they giving you? And so far, I have not paid a dime to podcasters.spotify.com to host my podcast. We'll see how that goes in the future. I didn't see any maximums, minimums, but generally speaking, I think they're just trying to continue to generate more ad revenue, and it's ad supported. I believe that's how it works. So there's some really nice extras. You can also have people voice message you, your listeners, that is, voice message you through Spotify, and you can listen to those and add those pieces into your podcast itself. So I could see saying, hey, everybody, let me know what you think about it. And if you have any good or bad, if you like about this or whatever, leave me a voicemail through Spotify. And if you want, if you're okay with it, I will use it as hey, everybody, here's some of the glowing reviews of how great this podcast actually is. I can see people doing that, or if it's a call-in show kind of a thing, almost like a call-in show, but I don't know. I haven't plumbed that depths of that yet from the voice messaging. So again, you can record right from your browser. The other pieces there in the cookbooking here is make sure you have some episode details. This is like, what is this particular episode about? Your episode title, I have heard you do not want to put in your episode number in your title. I don't know for sure if that's good or bad. I will learn more as I go because I'm learning this as I go. Your description of the episode itself, the publishing date, is this explicit or not? Are you using bad words or other things? Any additional details, I think you have options to do. You can say things like, is this a full podcast or is it just a trailer or is it a bonus? What is this? Season number and episode number. Those are items that you want to put in there as well. An episode number, I don't think you need it in your title since they really want you to syndicate your episode number in their metadata. So they've got that. You can upload your cover art. They have a really nice space to upload your cover art. There's some very specific details. I think this is educational material I would want to put in a different podcast on how to create such a thing. I use a couple of different things. GIMP is one of them. That's a free Photoshop-like tool. It's free, and I can link that to you in the show notes. Very handy to use. Takes a little bit of work. There's some learning curve there as well. There's other ways to do it. Feels like a different episode. So then there's this next step in not deviating from their getting started on Spotify podcasting is the engagement piece. And so they automatically add a Q&A question for people to respond to. Automatically, it's what do you think of this show? You can change that question to something else like, hey, what kind of a creator are you? So that's where I added mine in the first episode is to say, hey, what kind of online creator are you that's listening to this, if any? You don't have to answer, of course. You can also add a poll with a bunch of questions to say, hey, what kind of, I don't know, you could do anything you want, right? And see how many people answer in this kind of thing. What's the next episode you would like to hear? Choose from these three options. Do this, do that, or do that. And then take a poll from your listeners and see which direction do they want to go. I could see that working pretty well. That's just an example I just made up. And then there's the review piece of the getting started. This is all very wizard-like. I don't know if you remember the wizards of the past of Microsoft having wizards. The review. So before you continue, it will ask you about automated processing that they use to help your podcast reach a wider audience. This is their words, such as transcription, translating, and creating clips. So uploading your podcasts, you're electing to be okay with that. That's part of their terms and conditions of their service, allowing them to do that. That seems very likely to be only helpful for you rather than a negative. They'll also ask you about have you read Spotify's platform rules? Also very important. And some of it's kind of common sense. I recommend going through and reading that when you do. Really, it's all about, don't do bad things. Try to make it so that it's useful for everybody and not trying to, I don't even want to say it, but their rules are very important. But again, common sense dictates that, if it's not a hateful type of podcast, I think you're fine. You'll get what I'm saying. I'm not going to go into that. So of course, then you want to get your podcast name out there, which is like the series name, like what's the overall podcast name and the podcast description of the whole series, not just the episode of the whole series. So it does the particular episode first, and then it does the whole series. What are you talking about? You're the author, yourself. What kind of category? Category is important. That's what it uses to determine who to market to and what categories it's going to sit in or be displayed in. And what's your native language for the podcast itself. You can upload that cover art for an episode, and the cover art can be different for the podcast itself rather than each of the episodes. So you can have a different image for each episode. I personally don't think I'm ever going to do that. I feel like that's more work than it's worth, but you can do it. And then really the next step was just a wow. I just went to the next step of the getting started, and they said, we're going to let you know when it's available on Spotify itself. And hey, here's all the syndicate locations that we can help you with. Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, CastBox, Google, iHeartRadio. That's another actually getting bigger one. iHeartRadio, Overcast, Pocket Casts, and Radio Public. And each of them has basically like a help section on how to set it up so you can syndicate through this platform out to those areas. They won't do it automatically for you because they all need to have some kind of a login and a setup. That feels like another set of step-by-steps for a future podcast to talk about how did I set it up for distribution on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, CastBox, etc. So some of this information you've stored here for Spotify, again, I recommend that you keep your intellectual property. You make a copy of that information and you put it on there. You don't just type it in there. You make a copy of it locally, store it in a document, Google Doc, Word Doc, whatever it is. So you have that and you don't lose your intellectual property. You keep your descriptions, you keep your episode names, you store all that information in case the platform goes away. Sounds kind of paranoia. It sounds a little bit paranoid, but you will thank me later. Keep your IP, intellectual property, yourself, and then you can copy and paste it to other things. So you don't have to go to the site, take a copy there, move it to other things. All right. I hope that makes sense to you. But to me, this is a huge wow. Spotify also had, as part of it, the enabling the RSS feed from there to allow for other apps to pick that up. And sometimes those get picked up automatically. There are things that will go out there and pick up those RSS feeds if they're publicly available. And I turn that on because, hey, you want your podcast, and I would recommend it, to be listened to far and wide. So that's what I would go with. And that to me was a huge wow. Don't deviate. Be prepared to put this information in the getting started. And honestly, it was easy, but I had to think about it. And I had, thankfully, some prep time to think about my description and title and so on and so forth. Those things you want to do ahead of time, think it through, think what you're going to say, describe your podcast, and put it out there and walk through it. It was great. It was really amazing. I have to admit. Okay. You've got that out there. And in theory, this is a little bit of a cart before the horse kind of a situation, because mistake number 7 is really about, don't just try to start talking or interviewing someone for your podcast. Now, I did my first one and then I did the Spotify piece, so I knew what I was trying to do, so I could relate that to you in a future podcast, this one, to talk about what were the steps that I ran into and things that I should say. But if you're starting a podcast in general, going back kind of to square one, what you really want to do with any kind of podcast is make yourself some notes. This is kind of like going back to school, high school, grade school, and saying, I'm going to make an outline for my presentation. Most schools will make people do presentations. Same idea. Write out your questions, write an outline, do some research, put your information together. If you're talking about nonfiction, if you're talking about fiction and other things like that, or just reading or, those kinds of things, that's a little different, but certainly for technical or content value stream kinds of podcasts where you're providing free information out there, hey, write your outline, write some questions. Get good talking off the cuff, and later on, you may be able to just wing it and go for it. I'm not too bad, I think, in my self-assessment, but I like to have an outline. Also, when you're recording, by the way, as a side note, don't be afraid to hit the pause button and cough. In radio, they have a word for that. I forget what it is. It's the cough button or something like that, but it's okay to pause and then restart. Anyway, public speaking experience really, really helps a lot for this kind of thing for podcasting. I recommend Toastmasters. I'll put that in the notes. I don't get anything for Toastmasters. I was a member of Toastmasters for a while. It helped me, it was years ago, helped me tremendously. I recommend it actually to anybody who is interested in any kind of public speaking or any kind of production of those kinds of things, or even in a professional career. I think it's really, really helpful to you to do. It does take time, but it's a very friendly place to practice your public speaking. It's fantastic. Okay. Mistake number 8, you do not need to use expensive DAW software, digital, software. You don't need to use expensive software. I just said it before. Spotify has its own. It allows you to do that. I use Audacity. It allows me to mix, put things together. I'll put that link in the show notes. And, there's a certain number of things to do. I can create a course or another podcast specifically on how do you create using Audacity. Honestly, it's pretty darn simple, but there's some things that I ran into that might help you as well. But I use Audacity. Works great. Runs on any platform. It's fantastic. All right. Mistake number 9. We're getting towards the end here. Do not assume that you need an expensive microphone. You can use a smartphone. There's some very famous stories out there about folks that did not start with an expensive microphone. I don't think my microphone's that expensive. It's a Yeti. I love it. I've got the pop filter on it. It's USB based. And the computer itself was expensive because I like expensive computers because I'm a computer nerd, very much like that. But the Yeti's not outrageously expensive. Works great. I have got an arm on it. It hovers right in front of my face with the pop filter in between. It is fantastic. It works amazing. I also had a Blue Snowball microphone in the past. Logitech has good stuff. Again, I don't get any affiliate marketing for any of this stuff. I just really like this kind of stuff. You don't need an expensive one. You can 50, 60, 70, 80 bucks and you're in good shape. You really can make that work. Can you do it on your smartphone? You absolutely can. The microphones on smartphones are great, much like the cameras on smartphones now are great for taking video and those kinds of things. It's amazing, how much tech has really gone into these small compact spaces. But do not assume you need an expensive microphone. You don't have to. Mistake number 10. Do not edit the podcast yourself. Okay, this is a little bit deceptive. My apologies. You can edit your podcast yourself. If you're doing 30-minute to an hour podcasts, it takes time to edit your podcast. I personally recommend doing it with artificial intelligence. The guys at resound.fm, totally amazing. This software works like a dream. Go to selfpubempire.com/resound. RESOUND to check it out. It is so cool. It uses artificial intelligence to get the ums and the oohs and the ahs out of it, filler sounds. Those are actually going to come up, I think, that I just made here when I use the editing on this. It's going to come up with those as well. I'm going to have to keep those. You can check those out. They don't necessarily go away. We'll have space there. You can check out what that looks like. We got a free trial linked there through it as well. You can try it and you get 1 hour of processed audio, all the great features, the filler sound detection, the enhancement, which is what I use. It's amazing. Trimming. It's amazingly good. I hope you guys are listening at Resound because this really, truly is a fantastic piece of software. It's amazing. So go check it out. You can edit yourself. You can get an editor to help you as well. That will cost you more money on a regular basis. But if you can avoid it because using the right tools makes it so much easier. Mistake number 11. Do not ignore having a plan or some thoughts on monetization. Now, okay, wait a minute, Kevin. So you're thinking to yourself, hold on a second, hold on. You're talking about your content value stream. It's your free value stream. It's your podcast. You're going to send this out to the world. You're going to provide great information and let people learn from you and all this great stuff. And you're going to do it for free. Yes, that is true. Hosting seems to be relatively free. My website costs some money. Certain things cost money. My microphone costs some money. And really, I want to go from posts to profit. That's really what I want to do. So what do you mean have a plan for monetization? Well, the interesting part is on Spotify in particular, again, only because I started there, is they have a way to monetize your podcast. So they're actually offering this as part of the extras that they offer you as their hosting company for you. When you go through this agreement process and get your podcast up on Spotify and allow them to use, again, used to be Anchor, allow them to use your podcast in Spotify. They're really putting a lot of effort into this because there's a lot of money in podcasts. It's really amazing to me to think that they will allow you to monetize your podcast. So there's a couple of things, right? So when you go there and check it out, they will sign you up potentially if you have enough listeners for host-read ads. They'll check the eligibility requirements. You have to publish within the last 60 days and reach basically 1,000 Spotify listeners. That is specifically 1,000 Spotify listeners. So if you have 1,000 different downloads of your podcasts, singular or plural, once you get past that point, then the next thing will allow you to have some host-read ads, and that allows you to monetize. So then that detail, I don't have yet. I'm not there. I'll just be honest with you. I didn't do it yet, but it'll be there to allow you for that. There are other great podcasts out there talking about monetization of podcasts, so on and so forth. That's not my original intention, but I did think about that. And so I very much enjoy the fact that Spotify's got this in place for you. More interestingly enough, they actually allow for subscribers. So if you're really popular, you can create a podcast, maybe another podcast, a separate one, especially if you're doing this full time. I mean, that would be really amazing to do, and to allow for subscribers. So subscribers you could create a free podcast to generate a large enough following, and then eventually have a subscription-based model for maybe another podcast with more detailed information or something else just for those subscribers or people that are your fans. That's pretty cool. In addition, you can go the donation route. So they allow set up on donations. So you can have people that just want to support you, kind of like Patreon, really for podcasts, just through this to allow you to do monthly donations for the podcast. That's also pretty cool. I did neither of those things. I did none of them, of course, just to start off with. Talk about those later as I go. I might try them and share with everybody here how those things went. And you will then learn from me and see how badly I mess it up and then how maybe I get it to work. So have some plan for monetization, at least some thoughts on that or some goals, but it doesn't have to be your only goal in life. But if you want to go from posts to profit, then I recommend that you start thinking about that earlier, the better. All right, we are at the end here. Mistake number 12. Do not be afraid to dig deeper and have some fun with it. I find this to be actually important for me personally because I tend to be very business oriented. But I began to realize that this podcasting thing is beginning to become a lot of fun. I'm really enjoying it. I like to talk. I like to investigate and review and gather data and then provide it out. And I like to teach. These are things that I really like to do. So I like to dig deeper on some of these topics. I really enjoyed cookbooking my way through the Spotify podcast hosting, which honestly was really, really cool. Don't do what most podcasts do, right? Create 3 episodes and then quit because it didn't take off. That's just the way life is. It's going to take some time or some effort to market your podcast. Another topic to talk about in some other podcast in the future. But be consistent. Stick with it. Don't be afraid to be consistent. If this is your content value stream that you want to create, be consistent. Keep going. Keep publishing. Keep in mind too that, with experimentation becomes knowledge and learning. You're not an expert, but you're just beginning, and that's okay. I haven't gone over this, setting up Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, any of that stuff either in this podcast, because that's just another huge set of topics to go over. I'm going to probably do that in another episode of this podcast to talk about that, because I do really want to make sure that I've got those documented so that I know what I'm doing, and I can help you with those as well. Certainly have fun, experiment, enjoy, look at the topics for podcasts that are out there or what maybe is really popular or things that you like. My opinion is it's much more important to podcast about something you like and are passionate about versus trying to find a trend about things that are out there. Hopefully the two converge. There's a trend and you also like it. So therefore it'll be fun and useful to people at the same time, and you'll get a nice big following. That would be fantastic. And for more help, of course, check out my website. Show notes for this particular episode, selfpubempire.com/podcast. You can go there. That wraps up my 2-part series, the beginning, avoiding mistakes, creating a podcast, setting it up. I really hope you enjoyed it. I know I did, and I enjoyed cookbooking my way through this. It was a lot of fun to try to do tons of stuff there. I have some bonus material out on the website for setting up some Spotify settings for podcasters. There's a few things to do that out there that'll help with the marketing pieces. Certainly talk about that on the bonus material, or have that in the bonus material in the show notes area. So go ahead and check that out for this particular episode. But for now, I really hope this helped you. And I really hope that you can continue with me on this journey as we move from posts to profit. Thanks for listening. Hey, congratulations. You just listened to another episode of the Self Pub Empire podcast. I really hope you found something inspiring, useful, and actionable for your own entrepreneurial and business aspirations. Let's keep connecting as solopreneurs, authors, and online creators of all kinds. For more information, how-tos, great tools, and show notes for the show, head over to selfpubempire.com/podcast. Until next time, let's continue moving from posts to profit.